Thanks, Louise. I guess this is a topic on which I don't need to say very much because it really is not terribly controversial at all. There are no big issues on the use of nutritional supplements in sport, so we can easily reach a consensus on what's important and what's not. But I guess the title was chosen to illustrate some of the problems because supplements are used widely and they're also abused by various sections of the community. And I put in a picture of Frankie Fredericks training with Colin Jackson, and I gather that he'll be here sometime this afternoon. And I wanted to set the use of supplements in context because I think it's important that we recognize that although we are spending 2 days talking about nutrition, compared to things like training and talent and motivation and resistance to injury, nutrition is not a big factor in determining the outcome. But it's something you can change quite easily. And it's something that does limit some people's ability. If you've got the talent and the motivation and you train hard but you make poor food choices, you won't realize your potential. But nutrition's easy to change and supplements are easy to take. So it's very attractive to the athlete to say, well, I'm not terribly talented and I'm not really motivated to train very hard, but I can get something out of a bottle that's going to make me better. Equally, if you're training to the limit of what you can sustain and you're doing everything else right, what are the options that are available? You can't train harder. You can't change your genetic potential. You have to look for something that's going to make the difference. So why has the issue of supplements become so important in recent years? And one of the main factors is that there's a lot of money at stake. There's a lot of money at stake for the athlete who can win, but I don't think that in itself is the only reason because athletes are always motivated to win. But there's a lot of money associated with winning, and there's a lot of money at stake for the supplement companies. So the elite performer is very motivated. But so too are the people who exercise for fun. They're exposed to the same information. This is the sort of advice you should be following. These are the supplements that can help you. So if you're just the occasional fun runner, there's still pressure to do it. If you're concerned about your health, there's a strong message that says supplements can help. If you're concerned to lose weight, there's a huge market in weight loss supplements. If you're concerned to change your body shape, there's a supplement there that can help you. Why has this become a problem recently? Several different factors, but undoubtedly the change in the legislation is one that's had an effect because the restrictions on the sale of supplements seem to be almost entirely absent in some countries. They're limited in other countries. But of course, internet selling means it doesn't matter what your national controls are. You can buy it from somewhere that doesn't have those national controls. So as far as many of the supplements are concerned, there are fairly liberal labeling laws. There are very liberal laws relating to the claims that can be made. And the issues governing the manufacture, the quality control, are pretty lax in some cases. Rather than go through some of the supplements that I think might be useful and the ones that I'm reasonably sure are not, I thought in the talk, because I've done some of those things in the paper, in the talk I might focus on some of the issues associated with the supplement use. And we need to understand who's using supplements, what supplements are they using, why are they using supplements, and then we can begin to understand how we might change some of those behaviors. So there's a lot of athletes out there using supplements, and I've quoted a meta-analysis which is now a little bit dated, but it does set the scene. Looking at a large number of athletes, overall prevalence about 46%. But within that, there are some sports where some surveys show 100% use of supplements. Every single athlete surveyed using supplements. There's a tendency perhaps for more people at the elite level in some sports to use supplements, but the prevalence varies enormously and there's a wide range of different factors. We have to be careful about those survey data though, and there are many reasons for being careful. It depends what questions you ask and how you ask the questions. Study here on, I think this was on marathon runners, David? Yes. Asking the same questions, supplement use, by slightly different methods. So you either come up with a 70% use by asking about frequency of use, or you ask people to record their use and you get less than 50%. That's a big difference in the estimated prevalence. So we have to be concerned about the reliability of the data. Some people, some surveys have asked about supplements and included things like sports drinks and energy bars as supplements. Others have specifically excluded those. Some surveys ask about regular or routine use, and others include simply statements, what supplements have you used in the last year? So one thing taken once in the last year is given the same weighting as something that's taken once or twice a day. Athletes may respond with what they did yesterday rather than what they normally do. We know that athletes may be reluctant to admit to the person administering the questionnaire what supplements they're using and how much they're using. Or they may exaggerate their use to impress or thinking they might impress. Anybody who's worked with athletes knows they're incredibly forgetful. We look at doping declaration forms, for example. Virtually every athlete who's tested positive then says, oh, I forgot to list, and they come up with a long list of supplements and medications they were taking at the time of a positive test. So they are forgetful. And of course, athletes use things they don't want to tell anybody about. So the survey data, I think, are very unreliable. But there's also lots of things they don't tell us. Often the survey doesn't tell us what kind of supplements were being used. Very seldom do they tell us the amounts being used. And importantly, if we want to understand the area, they don't tell us why athletes are choosing to use supplements. So we have to go to different areas to try and piece together the information. We got involved in supplement issues and got some athletes to record their supplement use during a period of training. And this was what one athlete on the left-hand panel there told us he was taking on one single day during a week's training when we had him monitor his supplement use. So he was a sprinter, so he didn't get up too early in the morning. First intake was at 10 minutes after 10 in the morning. He's taking 3 grams of lysine with 30 milligrams of vitamin B6. So the evidence that lysine has any beneficial effect, as far as I'm aware, is pretty well absent, and why somebody would take 30 milligrams of B6 in the morning, I'm not entirely clear. 4 phosphate tablets, 2 scoops of protein powder, so of course there's protein powder in there, he's a sprinter. 3 teaspoons of acetylglutamine, well, that's what he thought it was because that's what it said in the bottle, but when you looked at what was actually in there, there was some carnitine, some branched-chain amino acids, and some glutamine. What there wasn't in there was some acetylglutamine. 3 grams of vitamin C, so he's on 50 times the RDA, and he still hasn't had his breakfast. He's on 3 tablets of a herbal detox compound, and he's on 50 milligrams of zinc. I think in UK the recommendation is you shouldn't exceed a daily intake of about 15 milligrams except under medical supervision. He's exceeded that 3-fold, and it's still not breakfast time. So lunchtime, it's more lysine, B6, and so on. So he's now on 100 milligrams a day of vitamin B6. And he's got more stuff at night. So the extent of supplement use is enormous in some sections of the athletic community. Other reports coming from Australia suggest large numbers of supplements being taken by some athletes. So the reality is many of our elite athletes are taking large amounts of dietary supplement. Why do athletes take so many supplements and take so much particularly? If you speak to them, they say, well, it says on the label that 1 scoop's good, so 2 scoops must be twice as good. Or they say, okay, it says the recommended dose of creatine is 20 grams a day for 5 days, but I know somebody who's taking 40 grams a day, so I'll take 100 grams a day. And it says not to use it for more than a week, but I've been using it for a month. And those are the realities when we speak to athletes. In other cases, the amount may be far less than the athlete thinks they're getting, because analysis of many of the products that are bought over the counter shows they don't contain significant amounts of some of the expensive ingredients. So the reality is we don't know what athletes are taking. We can get some information from sales figures. In 1990, creatine was sold to laboratories as a chemical reagent. In 2003, it's sold to athletes as a dietary supplement. The figures are difficult to establish, but these were the ones I quoted. As far as I'm aware, no athletes were using creatine in 1990. Published figures I saw reported 3.1 million kilograms in the year 2000. That's a lot of creatine. Hydroxymethylbutyrate wasn't used as a supplement just a few years ago. The last figure I saw, and somebody might be able to update me on that, said that the commercial market for hydroxybutyrate supplements to athletes in 1998 was worth about $30 to $50 million. So we're talking a lot of money. Figures for the total supplement market in the US, perhaps $16.7 billion. So somebody referred to protein supplements as being, did you say $1 million industry or $1 billion industry? It doesn't really matter. It's small beer compared to the supplement business. There's a lot of money at stake. Why do they use supplements? Hard to figure. If we speak to athletes, they tell us their diet's not very good. Modern farming methods, they tell us, have eliminated vitamins and minerals from the foods they eat. So they need to take supplements. The diet's not good enough. They need extra supplements because they're training hard, or they've got a competition coming up, and stress increases the requirement. In some cases, they say a specific benefit on performance. In other cases, it's none of those things. It's just because their pals are taking them, or they hear that their opponents are taking them, which may or may not be true. And in other cases, it's been recommended by a coach, a parent, or somebody else who's got an influence. We talked about iron supplementation earlier. The statement at the end there is based on personal experience with an athlete who was taking iron supplements. We suggested she have blood sample drawn to be checked for iron status. She'd had that done. What was the outcome? Everything was fine. Wasn't anemic. Ferritins were there. Everything else was there. Why are you taking them? Just in case. Well, if your iron status is normal, there isn't a just in case. It's not a rational decision that underpins the use of dietary supplements, and that's one of the difficulties we have to face when we talk about using supplements. Where does the information come from? It comes from coaches who don't know anything about nutrition, or it comes from popular magazines where advertisements are disguised as editorial features. And one of the striking things about those advertisements is they never say that there's anything that doesn't help. It's always positive. And the reality is that athletes don't distinguish between scientific fact based on either laboratory or field studies that are carefully controlled, and anecdote or even endorsement where athletes are paid to make statements. I made this comment recently at a coaches meeting, and the coaches howled me down saying that's absolutely nonsense. All our coaches are well educated. They've been through training programs. They know about these things. Survey of general practitioners in the UK a few years ago showed that 75% of the information on drug prescription that general practitioners base their prescribing on comes from advertisements from pharmaceutical companies. It doesn't come from unbiased sources of information. So the coaches are less able to discriminate than the athletes, than the doctors. There's a lot of wrong information about there, and we shouldn't just pillory the supplement companies. The statement from Standard Textbook says there is no scientific evidence at the present time to indicate that athletic performance can be improved by modifying a basically sound diet. Is that true? It may be what we come up with in a consensus statement, but most of it would say there are some things you can do that will affect athletic performance. The statements at the bottom from a relatively recent book, two of the authors, Arthur Wydyard and Garth Gilmore. Wydyard has coached several Olympic gold medalists. If he stands up and talks to athletes, they listen to somebody who's coached gold medalists. I haven't coached any Olympic gold medalists. But in that book, in the section on nutrition, you'll read that in anaerobic exercise, the body uses for energy about 60% carbohydrates, 25% fat acids, whatever they are, and 15% protein. Now, I'm puzzled as to how much protein you can use in anaerobic exercise, and I'm not convinced you can use 25% or get 25% of your energy from fatty acids, but there we are. We're told that calcium gluconate before an event helps because muscle contractions require calcium ions. Well, I don't think anyone would dispute that muscle contractions require calcium ions, but it's hardly a basis on which to recommend that athletes take calcium gluconate. And we're told that salt is not necessary for life. And I think we discussed this issue yesterday. and concluded that an adequate salt intake is indeed essential. But this is the information that's presented to athletes. So when we look at the use of dietary supplements, we have to bear in mind this is the context in which athletes are taking supplements. And the advertising, of course, is very powerful. And the athlete is not good at discriminating. And scientists are often not good at communicating information to athletes. We give them small pieces of paper with closely typed text, which is boring. The advertisers produce something which is a little bit more exciting, and they've got powerful companies behind them selling messages, before and after. It's not the same guy.
Before and after.
And this is in 8 weeks. This is in 8 weeks of training. So the athlete doesn't read the small print. The athlete looks at the picture. And he may want the physique, he may want the girl who's appeared magically after supplementation, but it's a very powerful message. So this is what we have to compete against. And of course, there's another issue, which is often the fact that when people take supplements, they feel better. And they feel better for many reasons. There's undoubtedly a placebo factor, but many of the supplements on the market contain a little something which does make people feel better. People respond to caffeine, people respond to ephedrine, and these are commonly added to herbal pick-me-up type supplements, sometimes in very large amounts. That's okay if the label clearly states that they're there, but the label doesn't always clearly state that they're there. And these are results from the analysis of stimulant products which don't declare caffeine or ephedrine on the label and don't declare herbs which contain caffeine or ephedrine. So there's no guarana, there's no mawang in these supplements, at least as far as the label is concerned. 110 supplements, 14 contain caffeine and 2 samples contain ephedrine. So yes, these may well make athletes feel better, but it's not the ingredients listed on the label which have the effect, and that's one of the difficulties. So we touched earlier, and I think several people have touched on the issue of costs and benefits, and I think we have to look at doing a cost-benefit analysis, weigh up the costs, weigh up the benefits. The problem is we don't know what many of the benefits are. If we take antioxidants as an example, we can't be sure that we know all of those parts of the equation. We don't know the costs. Is this going to be harmful, either to performance or to health? So completing the cost-benefit analysis is good in theory. In practice, it's difficult, if not impossible. So I'll touch briefly on a couple of supplements as examples, and the written text includes detail on a number of supplements. I've categorized the supplements by looking at what they do for athletes. Those that promote tissue growth and repair, those that promote weight loss, and specifically fat loss, some that enhance energy supply, some that promote immune function and resistance to illness and infection, some that have effects on the central nervous system, some that have effects on joint health, others specifically to promote recovery, and of course the sports drinks, energy bars, and others which perhaps are not truly supplements. Supplements with something to offer. I've said I'll show 3 examples: caffeine, creatine, bicarbonate. Others where there's some evidence, but perhaps the evidence isn't strong enough to put them into the first category. But we then say, well, how strong does the evidence have to be? And this table's based on some information that Asger Jukendrup put together as part of a European project to look at scientific claims on foods for sportsmen and women. And if you're going to assess them, you have to say, well, what's the strength of the evidence based on the available information? And if we look at some of the laboratory tests of performance, they are not perhaps as precise as we'd like them to be. There's a large degree of variability. So if we do a time to exhaustion trial, the test-retest reliability is not terribly good. Depends on a number of factors, but it's unlikely to pick up a very small effect on exercise performance. And indeed, we might say a time trial might pick up a 1% effect on performance, a 2% effect. That sounds pretty good. Until we look at some of the things in sport. These are the finishing times of the first 7 finishers in this year's men's race at the London Marathon. The winner did 2 hours, 7 minutes and 56 seconds. So did the guy who finished second. and the guy who finished 7th was 0.16% different. Now this is a distortion, of course, but we all distort things to suit our own objectives. But what it does illustrate is the difference between winning and losing is not 1% or 5%. It's often a very small fraction. Not always. Sometimes it's very big. But it may be very small. And the chances of us producing scientific evidence to show that this product or that product has an effect at this sort of level of precision is extremely unlikely. And I think it's important when we bear that in mind as we look at some of the studies that have been done on supplement years. So briefly, I'll touch on creatine. It's the one that's attracted an awful lot of attention in recent years. The number of papers published on creatine in recent years is enormous. You all know the background to creatine. You need some. It functions in the muscle as a high energy source. And there is good evidence that high-dose supplementation can increase muscle creatine content. Typically, we get about 1 gram a day, but that depends on the diet. If we eat a high-meat diet, we'll get a large amount of creatine from the diet. If we eat a vegetarian diet, we'll get virtually none. And it's interesting that there aren't many athletes out there in strength and power sports where creatine is important who are vegetarians. So is it the high meat content of the diet, or is it the creatine of the diet that's important to them? There are many studies in the literature that show that creatine supplementation acutely can improve performance, and I've cited a couple here. 3 30-second Wingate tests with short recovery, 20 grams of creatine a day for 14 days, and treatment group improved performance. In another one, 30 isokinetic contractions with short recoveries, 20 grams of creatine for 5 days, placebo group, and peak torque increased with creatine, no effect on the placebo. So there's a lot of studies out there suggesting that creatine supplementation in these sort of doses, well in excess of what you can realistically expect from the diet, which is an important issue. There isn't a way to say simply increase your intake of meat and fish and you can match these levels. These are large doses of creatine. An analysis from Paul Greenhalgh's laboratory suggested that the improvement in performance was closely tied, or reasonably closely tied, to the increase in the muscle creatine content. And that's important because many studies have not assessed whether there was or was not an increase in the muscle creatine content. Everybody quotes their own data. So here's one of our slides. We looked at the effect of creatine supplementation, 10 grams a day for 6 days. Our subjects had 2 legs, but we were only measuring one at a time, so we measured isometric strength in both legs. Creatine supplementation, increased strength, and then they followed with a placebo for a week, no further increase, and the effect was there in both legs. The placebo group, which I didn't show, sorry, the placebo group, no increase in the first week when they got placebo, and then an increase in the second week. My conclusion was going to be that the evidence for creatine is very strong. The feedback from the athletes is very strong. And my interpretation of the literature is it's reasonably good. But I'd like to thank Sam for drawing my attention to this meta-analysis which was carried out. They looked at all the studies up until the date of publication. Their inclusion criteria were obviously creatine supplementation studies. They included only randomized controlled trials or matched pairs designs. They restricted the studies to those that looked at short duration performance, less than 150 seconds, only those that included a placebo group. Being American, of course, they didn't look at any studies that weren't published in English, but they did include unpublished student theses. They excluded animal studies. They found 38 studies, but they excluded 9. As with all authors, of course, I looked in the reference list to see if it included the last study I showed you in muscle strength, and indeed it was included in the reference list. But when I looked in the text, it hadn't been included in the analysis because they said the lead author was away from the country of residence at the time of the survey, so they hadn't pursued him. Now, I'm never away from my office, so they didn't pursue too hard. But when they completed the meta-analysis, they found that the mean effect size was 0.07. and the confidence interval crosses 0. So their conclusion, creatine supplementation has no significant effect on performance lasting less than 150 seconds. That's not the conclusion I reached in my text. So when we do an unscientific trawl of the literature, when we all read the literature, certainly when I read the literature, my conclusion from the published literature is there's fairly good evidence to suggest that creatine supplementation can improve performance. When I speak to the athletes, they're a little bit stronger than that. They believe creatine improves performance. The sales figures would suggest the athletes believe that creatine improves performance. They're willing to spend money on it. The scientific meta-analysis says creatine supplementation has no significant effect on performance. So we have an interesting dilemma. Maybe we don't. I do. What about caffeine? Thinking about dilemmas. Caffeine's got a number of effects. It's a central nervous system stimulant. It has direct effects on muscle excitability, and it has metabolic effects. It is weakly addictive, and for those who habitually take caffeine, sudden cessation may give adverse withdrawal effects. So there are some interesting issues relating to the use of caffeine. Sensitivity and metabolism of caffeine vary greatly between individuals. There's good evidence of performance-enhancing effects, both in relatively short-term high-intensity exercise and in prolonged exercise, and the performance effects are seen at rather low doses of caffeine, in contrast to the earlier studies where high caffeine doses were used. You can see here a dose of 5 milligrams of caffeine per kilogram body weight in these subjects did not produce a urinary caffeine level above the IOC's doping threshold, 12 nanograms per mil. In 1 or 2 people, 9 milligrams did, but for many people it didn't. And even very, very large doses of caffeine does not exceed the threshold for some individuals, although it does for others. There are some interesting issues relating to caffeine. There's a proposal it be removed from the banned list, in which case our discussion is academic, but at present the status of caffeine is not entirely clear. Is it a banned substance with a reporting threshold of 12 nanograms per mil, or is it a restricted or controlled substance which athletes can take? It's certainly not banned out of competition, so the athlete can take as much as they like, but they may fail a drugs test if they take caffeine in competition. I'm sure that Lawrence will talk about these issues later. Another supplement which may not be classified as a dietary supplement but does make us think, is this a dietary supplement or is it not, is bicarbonate, which is used by many athletes. Why is bicarbonate used? It's used in events where there's a high rate of anaerobic glycolysis, where we produce acidity within the muscle. There's some buffering within the muscle, and there may be negative effects on some of the enzymes of the glycolytic, so there may be other things that negate those effects. There may be direct effects on muscle contraction, and there's certainly an effect on sensory nerves. What can you do about it? You can buffer the acidity with an antacid, and studies on athletes suggest that giving bicarbonate can improve exercise performance at 800 meters or at 1,500 meters. These were independent studies carried out in different countries at different times by completely independent laboratories on athletes who were not particularly well trained. So these were male subjects, 2 minutes 5.8 in the control, no difference in placebo, but a 3-second improvement in performance. That's a real improvement in performance. So some clear suggestions that bicarbonate use can improve performance. Some people experience gastrointestinal problems. Most people don't experience major problems. There may be other alkalinizing agents, and its use is restricted to short-term high-intensity exercise. I won't talk about other individual supplements, and I'll finish by talking about some of the potential adverse effects of supplement use. There are many cases documented of supplements containing impurities, and the ones identified there are not specifically a problem for the athlete, but they do indicate the lack of regulation of the process. There are many cases in the published literature that supplements do not contain expensive ingredients listed on the label. There's good evidence that some products contain doping agents that shouldn't be there. How do you know when you buy a product whether any of those things is or isn't in there? And the answer is there's no easy way to know. The IOC Medical Commission commissioned a study from the doping lab in Cologne They went out, they sent students around the world who had a great time traveling around to buy dietary supplements. They bought 634 non-hormonal supplements, and I'm not going to talk about the pro-hormones. These were all non-hormonal supplements in 13 different countries. So they bought them from different sources. Round about half of them were from companies that sold pro-hormones, and the others from companies which didn't sell the pro-hormones. When they did the analysis, they found 11 different anabolic androgenic steroids, mainly pro-hormones of testosterone and nandrolone. Total of 94 individual supplements, that's 14.8%, contained pro-hormones that weren't declared on the label. And for another 10% approximately, it wasn't clear if there was something there or not. 23 contained pro-hormones of nandrolone and testosterone, 64 only pro-hormones of testosterone, and 7 only nandrolone. So there's a lot of contaminated supplements out there. Other labs have shown the same thing many times. Methendienone has recently been shown to be present in high doses in supplements as a particularly nasty anabolic steroid, was widely used, Dianabol. Use largely stopped among athletes, A, because it's easily detected, and B, because its tendency to cause liver tumors. These were not small amounts, these were large amounts of an anabolic steroid. I've referred to the problem of caffeine and ephedrine. I've referred to the problem that many supplements don't contain the expensive ingredients, but the situation as it stands for athletes, they are liable if they produce a positive test, whether they knew there was something in that supplement or not. I used to have two simple rules of dietary supplements, and I know that many of you have seen this slide before, so I apologize. The first rule says if it works, it's probably banned, and the second rule says if it's not banned, it probably doesn't work. And until a few years ago, that stood me in good stead. But rule number 3 says there may be some exceptions, because that's the cop-out, isn't it? We have to say, what are the exceptions? The substances which are not banned, but which can improve performance, which are not detrimental to health, and have something to offer to the athlete. And that makes it difficult, because as soon as you put in rule number 3, every supplement seller says, mine's in the exception category. My one works and it won't cause you problems. So what might the consensus statements be? I think Scott Powers must have copied his caution about indiscriminate use of something from the same place I copied my caution. But I would say athletes are cautioned against the indiscriminate use of dietary supplements, would be my first statement. Supplement use can have a role when food intake or food choices are restricted, or as a short-term remedy where deficiency syndrome has been shown to exist. It sounds rather familiar, doesn't it? Supplement use does not compensate for poor food choices. Athletes contemplating supplement use should conduct a cost-benefit analysis balancing the potential benefits against the financial cost, the possible adverse effects on health and performance, and the risk of a positive doping test. But I recognize that that cost-benefit analysis cannot reasonably be conducted. For a small number of supplements, the balance of evidence supports a beneficial effect on some types of performance. These supplements include creatine, and we might want to score that off, caffeine, and bicarbonate. Each of those carries its own particular issues. Finally, there is no evidence that androstenedione and similar pro-hormones are anabolic agents, and these supplements may pose serious health risks. Thank you.